Just learned in the general session. My name is DJ Ralston, and I'm the project director for the VR Technical Assistance Center for Youth, or what is known as the Y-TAC. So I was saying before folks got in the room, I don't necessarily have anything formal prepared for this, and it certainly I don't think will go the whole time. It'll just be kind of be based on our discussions. But as I also said in that general session, I really am about building relationships, so I kind of prefer that I don't have anything really formal prepared and that we can just kind of, engage in a dialogue. You guys can ask some questions about what it is the Y-TAC is doing, where we're going to go. I can talk a little bit more about the focus of our work. So does that sound good to everybody?
Yep.
Okay. So we are the Y-TAC. It feels like, I don't know. Yeah, we are the Y-TAC. And it's interesting because when we look at this range of technical assistance centers that's been funded by RSA, I would say that our TA center probably has the most crossover, or we cross over the most other centers. We cross over the Workforce Innovation Technical Assistance Center because they're doing the pre-employment transition services, which obviously is focused on youth. That may not be our target population of youth, but we are focused on youth. We are talking to them regularly. That's the other thing that I can do, is I can talk a little bit about what the youth focus centers are doing together. But so we cross over Y-TAC. We also cross over Y-TAC in that we see and believe that we will see from the state agencies a large demand around supported and customized employment. And there's going to be a good population of youth that fall in that 21 to 24, in most states 26, I think, if you're Michigan, where the students have aged out of school and they need to be, they're sitting at home in mom and dad's basement. They may or may not be on benefits, and who we want to help get engaged in work. And within our center, this was something I didn't talk about. The Y-TAC too has a bunch of partners. Our partners include Cornell University, that include Thomas Golden and Dave Brewer. We have a lot of knowledge in-house about work incentives between Thomas running Cornell's Institute. I'm also a certified work incentive coordinator. So we will be looking at that piece of it, certainly because we know that that's really important, particularly as we look at the poverty population of youth, families that a youth may be receiving SSI, their age 18 redetermination comes, and that youth is continued on SSI roles as an adult, and the family is still dependent upon that income. We know that that's going to be an issue, that can be a barrier to work. Those are types of things that we want to be able to engage that 21 age out population about. We also know that families have concerns over long-term benefits management, particularly as it relates to Medicaid. So looking at kind of some of those services, looking at ABLE accounts and actually, financial capability and things like that. That's all kind of in the wheelhouse of what the Y-TAC can help address and help the VR system be able to address with these youth and their families. We see a large need around the supported and customized employment, and so we do have partners. So we have Cornell. We also have the folks from Mark Golden Associates, so Norsiva Schumper, Abby Cooper, Mike Callahan. Those folks are all, on contracts with us as well. It was great seeing Siva again. I'm like, Siva, you trained me 10 years ago in Alaska on customized employment. And she was like, oh. So, but we have those folks in our center. We also have a range, I think actually Madan might have put this most eloquently. So we have a cadre of subject matter experts around the country as well that include, former RSA folks, that include, program design folks. Donna Mundy, who's with the Institute for Educational Leadership, who's kind of like what I refer to as the fairy godmother of high school high tech, which is a great program that helps students with disabilities engage in STEM careers, including work-based learning experiences while in school. That's definitely a program model that we can bring. And then we also have some folks that are really content heavy in understanding and the knowledge of the interplay of the workforce development system. And you guys heard me kind of say in that first session, one of the things that I think that the Y-TAC really has to offer states is the fact that, under WIOA, there's a lot of need to collaborate that's new, and it's gonna be hard, and change is scary. And, one of the things that I think that the Y-TAC really has got a lot of strength in is being able to help those systems talk to each other, and doing that both from the ground up and from the top down. being able to kind of look at, go into a state and look at what a service delivery flow looks like on the ground for multiple different systems, walking through those flows and helping each of those agencies kind of find the intersection. So how does an adjudicated youth come out? What happens when they go into juvenile probation? How are they served? Who are they connected with? How do they come back? And where does VR fit into that? If we're re-engaging them in school, what does that re-engagement process look like? How do we get them connected with pre-employment transition services? All of these things that would eventually, ultimately, hopefully lead to better post-secondary outcomes, including, entrance into training, post-secondary training, attaining certificates, things along those lines. So those are a lot of the things that, the Y-TAC will really focus on, is kind of building that cross-system, cross-boundary work, and doing that particularly at the customer level. One of the things that we've found, or that we've seen at the Y-TAC through various jobs leading up to this, is one of the things that happens is we call it the warm body theory. And I'm not sure what the academic kind of theory is behind this, or what the research says, but I know that there's something because somebody was talking to me about it. But in our warm body theory is like when you've got a youth who needs who has got specific needs, if you bring that youth to the table and then you start coordinating the services for that youth, it's amazing what can happen. And the thing about youth is, and part of the reason that I love this population, and it should be noted that I have a 9-year-old son, a 16-year-old stepdaughter, and a almost 19-year-old stepson. So I must love kids because that's enough to kill anybody. But, one of the things that we love about youth is there are actually a lot of resources out there. And, I was just having that quick conversation with you earlier about some of the resources and areas that, folks, particularly public agencies, may not be thinking about in terms of accessing. And that's, again, a big portion of what the Y-TAC work is going to really be, is kind of looking at what's available in the community and doing that through the use of the Guideposts for Success curriculum, framework, which is, the kind of comprehensive transition framework that's looking at what all youth need, and then the elements that youth with disabilities need in addition to what all youth need. So it's kind of bigger picture, or a bigger picture. That's kind of where we see our work. We do think that there can be implications for a range of service delivery across VR agencies. Like I said, when we start looking at our out of school, whether that's dropout or whether that's graduated, maybe they graduate without a diploma, or maybe they just graduate with a diploma, but they're still sitting at home and not doing anything. Now we're looking at 18. And 18 to 24. And so those can be played as a youth or adult. And that's a pretty amazing thing. Particularly, they could be accessing, in some instances, a WIOA Title I youth program as an 18-year-old, but be enrolled in VR as an adult. And then you've got 2 major service providers where you can coordinate those services. And the thing about youth and youth in transition is we also all know that not one single agency can meet every need of a youth in transition. So, the ability to collaborate is paramount. And the fact that there are many, many resources out there, because, we kind of spread it all apart, so everybody's trying to do more with less, it makes sense that we would want that youth to be able to access multiple services. And if they're going to be accessing multiple services, doesn't it make more sense for those services to actually be coordinated? So, we look at those services and we can establish, lines of communication around, the youth, with the youth and their family, driving that, helping to drive those conversations with all of those service providers, and then, establish some lines of communication and establish that sequence of services. Particularly thinking about WIOA as well, and the movement towards career pathways, and the emphasis of, career pathways. Curtis and I, Curtis Richards, who is the principal investigator for the Y-TAC and the director of the Center for Workforce Development at the Institute for Educational Leadership, we did a session at the NTAC's Capacity Building Institute about the intentional inclusion of youth with disabilities in career pathways, and what does that look like. And so, a big piece of that is about perhaps leveraging individualized learning plans and the assessment processes that are not necessarily happening as extensively. Tim gave me a hard time about all the questions that the Y-TAC asked. Fair enough, we did ask a lot, but we did try to make it as simple as possible for the states, in terms of just asking for, what's your satisfaction, low, medium, high. So they weren't huge. It wasn't very taxing in that sense. And as he said, we captured a lot of information that was applicable to targeted communities and Y-TAC, so, and NTAC, so I don't feel so bad. But, you know, kind of looking at preliminarily at some of those results, we have some good ideas that, you know, there is some high demand around serving the juvenile justice populations. There's high demand around serving the foster care populations. There's high demand for serving the disconnected and or homeless runaway. There's some high demand, obviously, around engaging employers, but there's also a fair amount of demand around, you know, competencies for engaging youth, for keeping youth engaged, and for a range of other kind of what we refer to as the suite of youth service professional knowledge, skills, and abilities. So again, those are all things that we've, yeah.
So when a youth is removed from their home and placed into group home or foster care, how is their VR eligibility determined?
I don't understand what's...
Well, if there's trauma in the home and the youth is removed from that situation and they're placed in foster care, is there an automatic assumption that because of their experience in the home, they fit into a VR or WIOA population for service, or is it? Oh, I'm sorry, I have to use the microphone. So the question is whether a foster youth, when they're removed from the home, or when a youth is removed from the home and they're placed in foster care, is there an assessment or determination of their eligibility for VR essentially because of the trauma they've experienced as a part of being removed from the home or whatever they might have
That's a good question.
seen or had happen there?
I mean, they still have to be considered to have a disability.
Right.
And I think for some youth, that trauma would create a disability, and for some it may not. So it's still very individualized, I think.
So how
I don't know, did you have another comment?
Well, that's exactly right. It's the determination is not based upon whether they're in or out of the home or there's been experienced any kind of trauma. The disability is going to be what drives the determination of eligibility. So, I mean, it obviously impacts the kid and the environment, and it may, you know, amplify, it may magnify, you know, those issues that are there, but baseline, the determination of eligibility still rests on whether or not there's a disability and it creates an impediment in their employment, and that there's something that VR can do to be able to move them towards competitive integrated employment.
So who flags that? Who interviews the student or the youth? Who, you know, what is that process of identifying this youth has some issues and concerns?
I was just going to ask, so what happens if the youth doesn't have an identified disability, but they need supports and
So
whatever?
this is, okay, so two questions here. You know, Mary, I think to answer your question, I think, you know, predominantly that's going to be, if the youth is in school, the struggles would probably predominantly be identified by their, you know, education provider, as well as whoever the foster care caseworker is. Like those communications are going to happen, which also goes to why we need to strengthen the relationship between the foster care agencies and, you know, VR, so that the foster care agency is aware that VR could be a potential resource, particularly if they see that the student is struggling, as well as obviously engaging the foster parent. So the simple answer there, I would say that those three would probably be most initially responsible for flagging that kid, so to speak, or that youth. But again, one of the things that we've seen is there's a fairly large disconnect. You know, foster care system is overloaded, so they're not necessarily aware that VR is out there. Honestly, I will tell you, I think that VR is one of the most underutilized resources in every state, and for a lot of reasons. You know, I think one of the other relationships that really needs to be improved is the relationship between VR and the DD agencies, and that's something that the Y-TAC, because we're going to have that 21 to 24, you know, population that is largely going to be, you know, youth that have pretty significant disabilities that are sitting at home, and that's why they're sitting at home in mom and dad's basement. So we see that as a way. to answer your question in regards to, I'm trying to keep it in there. Where did it go? So, so what happens? So what happens with those youth? So those youth, as Steve said, and as Sarah said, if they don't have a disability, they're not going to be eligible for VR. But part of what happens when we build these cross-system relationships is, in the midst of this, we're also going to pull Title I WIOA into the mix, which is Title I is specifically focused mostly on out-of-school youth, but they still have some propensity to carry in-school youth. So that split is about 75%. They need to serve 75% out-of-school or disconnected youth, and 25% in-school youth. But for all of the youth that they serve, there needs to be another barrier to employment there, and foster care or homelessness is one of those barriers. So that's an agency that could potentially step in and help that youth if they don't have a disability. And that agency is going to focus on work experiences, particularly summer work experiences, but also employability skills and the like within kind of their realm. So there are additional resources, but part of what we need to do as a larger system, and with WIOA, it's the perfect time. And I'm actually super excited. I think people think I'm a little not steady or I'm a little unsteady because I'm so excited about this. But with WIOA, it's a really exciting time to be able to bring all of these partners together.
So you would serve economically disadvantaged, your particular?
We can. VR can serve economically disadvantaged, so what you really have to do is you have to look at what the criteria is for each of these agencies. And this is something the Y-TAC is really good at as well, that we will be able to help VR do, is again, walking through kind of the service delivery flows, which includes understanding what the eligibility processes are. VR eligibility is predicated on disability and impediment to employment as a result of disability. Title I WIOA youth is predicated on economically disadvantaged, as well as an additional barrier, whether that's disability, whether that's pregnant and parenting, whether that's homeless and runaway, whether that's like foster care. So there's some other type of additional barrier there. So I think it's a lot of this is bringing together all these service providers. And let's not forget that we have community-based organizations who are focusing on targeted populations. We have faith-based organizations that we can engage. So there's a lot around, kind of what's happening at that regional and local level that is about building those relationships. And so part of what the Y-TAC, is offering to help states do is to build the collaboration both at the local level and at the state level. So, getting some steering committees in place, looking at what your common goals are. And, again, the passage of WIOA, the adherence to new common performance measures is going to make a big difference. This is a big change, and it's a huge change for state VR agencies. What did I hear? Somebody said there's 100 changes to Title IV. And like we said, and these are not just little changes. These are huge changes. So it's a very exciting opportunity to design some new customer service model, or basically service delivery flows and models that will help the agencies get these youth to the performance measures. And so if we're going to talk about that too, so obviously the regs aren't final. So what I'm about to say, I will caveat as all speculation, right? Everybody hear that? Speculation. But in the proposed performance measures, the way that we read the legislation, and if there's anybody in the room who knows better, please correct me. But our understanding is that the youth served through pre-employment transition services will not be subject to common performance measures, which makes sense because pre-employment transition services are looking at something else. And I know that there's still a lot of struggle with how that's going to play out, right? I'm kind of looking at Steve, yeah. So, but in our read, for the youth that aren't being served through pre-employment transition services, if they have an open case file, they're going to have to meet common performance, but it's going to be the common performance measures that are associated with the adult measures, because the common performance measures for youth only apply to the Title I youth program in the Workforce Innovation Opportunity Act. So this is actually a big thing. So when we look at that, that means employment for these youth at second quarter and fourth quarter post-exit, plus, an earnings change, potentially measurable skills gain, and they have no idea what that one's going to look like. And I have all sorts of ideas, but I'll get in trouble, so I can't say anything about that. let's just say I don't think that should be tied to standardized testing, because I think that that mitigates the whole point of the measure in the first place, which is to make sure that our folks who have significant barriers and challenges to employment are actually able to meet that performance measure, so that way they're not screened out of services for some way. Anyway, but one of the things that I think, that we think that the Y-TAC can really help do is help to kind of establish some program delivery models, within the context of what VR is already doing. We're not talking, huge radical changes, but let's make some tweaks that we know that we've seen. There's, kind of, experiential or promising practices out there in terms of service delivery to help get these, youth to these new performance outcomes, to getting to the fact that they're getting employed and that they're staying employed. So that 6 months after they're exited, they're still employed, and so that a year after they're exited, they're still employed. And not only is that going to necessarily be useful to that youth population, but that'll also be pretty relevant to the entire agency's population, because that's what they're going to be working with toward all their customers. And if, hey, if it works with a 21 to 24-year-old, what's to say it's not going to work with a 43 to 54-year-old? So, I mean, those are all things to kind of keep in mind.
My question is the center focused on more 21 to 24 who maybe drop out from high school, or?
It won't be just that. We'll focus the entire, we are transition age. So, I think we say 14 to 24 typically. So part of the reason I've talked about the 21 to 24 is because we know, for example, that group often is out of school. And because our center really is focused more on out of school and disconnected youth, as opposed to those that are the students with disabilities. And it'll be really interesting to see how that whole interpretation comes down. With the pre-employment transition services, because it could change. I mean, and if that changes, then oh boy, we're going to be in bed with NTAC and WinTAC all over the place. It's going to get really crowded.
Yeah, the reason I ask that is because some of the at-risk youth who are in school, if we can do early intervention, then actually they won't become the group of 21 to 24 that drop out from high school or stay in the basement, and then that actually may end up save a lot of effort and time in pulling them back to the right track.
Right. Well, and I'm hopeful. I mean, we have to be careful because we don't want to be stepping on folks' toes, and because RSA has basically said, you guys we're not serving, quote unquote, the students on special education plans, but we could be potentially serving youth who are in school who are not on comprehensive special education plans. And yes, that's where those types of things would come in. And we're going to look at youth development and leadership activities. We have a really strong host of, resources in that realm, including peer mentoring models. I was laughing as, was it Tim or as Chip? And I'm like, oh boy, I need to go talk to Chip, because, WinTAC and Y-TAC should be working together on those things to, minimize burdens to states and make it happen.
Could you comment on what's the model for this peer mentor that successfully works?
We've got a couple of models that we actually pulled from foundational work out of the National Collaborative on Workforce and Disability for Youth. So one, we have some youth service professional knowledge, skills, and abilities competencies around designing peer mentoring programs, but we've also got a couple of them through that have been specifically aimed at juvenile justice population. So having, former students who have been part of the juvenile justice system working in, group settings and one-on-one as peer mentors to students who are now coming out of that system. So students who have experienced it, transitioned, done well, coming back and doing kind of that peer mentoring. We've also seen that with the mental health population. We've used that model with the students who struggle with mental health experiences and challenges as well. So in terms of the nuts and bolts, do I have those out of the top of my head? No, not right now. But
do those mentors do this on a volunteer basis, or is there a pay incentive to do it?
It's normally, I believe our programs have mostly been on volunteer basis because in both the right turn and the tunnels and cliffs, which are the names for our juvenile justice and mental health ones, those are more comprehensive programs. So they're also getting engaged in other employability skills type things, as well as looking at work-based learning experiences, doing, that type of work in the community already. So
No, the mentors, are the mentors paid or volunteered?
I believe they're mostly volunteers, but they do receive training to do that work, and then they're also, gaining the experience of checking in on their mentees. I believe they even go to the job site. So
There's enough interest to be a mentor?
there has been in these programs, these cohorts. I will say the one thing about youth that's pretty amazing is that they, in this culture, they do actually want to help each other. And this age of, the millennials, like we were joking about millennials, right? And I'm like, they do. They want to help each other, and we're seeing that more and more, and we're seeing that across communities across the country. So they want to be actively involved with each other, and I think that maybe that's their answer to constantly having their screens. We do see the desire to interact. So
how does the selection of order play in a role in this service? And I have another question is, for the age between 21 to 24, if we have at-risk youth in that age, but they're in, like, let's say in college, and would they qualify for that kind of service, or people typically think this group is not as at risk as the other dropout group, that they would take longer to finish the college and then won't get a job as soon as the other one, so they may lengthen the period of time to have a closure status. So
Okay.
The first question is the selection of order.
Well, so the selection of order, I just I want to pull my hair out when we get to order of selection. I am sure in some ways that will factor in, but part of what the Y-TAC really intends to do is, in our intensive states at least, we want to be very intentional about everything being customized to what the state wants. Because remember, the Y-TAC isn't directly serving; we're helping the state VR agency to serve. If a state is in order of selection that we're going to go into and work with, we're going to talk to them about that, and we're going to figure that out. My short answer to that is this is where, again, we need to build a cross-boundary work that would allow some of these other agencies to get involved with that youth and help carry that youth, as part of that larger coordination of services and that sequence of services until VR is able to take that youth on from the waiting list. So that's kind of my short answer, but really it's going to be customized to each of the states, and I'll worry about that when I get there. In terms of your second question, help me, because you guys, clearly I can't hold more than one question in my head at a time. Sorry, guys.
It's okay.
My second question is, like, for example, in Michigan State, we have students can stay in the school system up to 26-year-old,
Right.
or students in college. So what happened is, in the current system, they don't want to serve students who may have another 2 or 3 years before they exit the school system, because that will lengthen.
Right. Honestly, I think we have to go back to VR's primary mission and eligibility. And is it, if a student is in school, I know, there are potential considerations if they're struggling in school and it's a result of disability, like potentially, and that could potentially be, an impediment to employment. But I think we have to go back to traditional eligibility for VR. It's going to be dependent upon whether or not they would be traditionally eligible for VR services under that process. So, again, if they may not be, I go back to, if you do foster some of this cross-boundary work. I know I'm starting to sound like a broken record, white guys. If you, foster some of that cross-boundary work, you may find that there are some other resources out there that can help that student, including, I think one of the big things too that we want to do is, build the relationship. And I think it's good in places, it's good in pockets, but maybe not universally, is building the relationships between the VR agencies and the student disability offices on community college campuses as well as four-year college campuses. There's a lot of room for growth there. There's a lot of room for helping kind of build that partnership, I think, in a lot of instances. So,
before I pass on, Michigan has the extra problem because their special ed law goes to 26, and that adds
right.
Most of the states, it would just be the traditional kind of.
Thank
So my question is coming more from a researcher standpoint. The work that I do is research.
Okay.
I know. Boo.
No, not boo. Just, I hope I understand. You just, if you start talking p-values, you're going to lose me.
No. But it's more of a, so the work that I want to be doing really is with VR agencies and youth and trying to help them build up some practices that might, see some better outcomes for their youth. But my challenge coming from, someone who's outside of the public service arena now is finding agencies that are interested in doing that work too. The best research practice partnerships are where both parties are getting something good out of it. So I was wondering if your center has any mechanism for linking states and researchers who have mutual interests so that we could find, people to work with.
We do not formally, but I'll tell you, I don't have a card because I'm apparently not a grown-up and forgot those.
I don't have them either.
But we can exchange contact information, and I would be happy to, for us to exchange some emails. And, if we're going into states and we're working there and it makes sense, like, why wouldn't I give you a call and, and talking to the state about it? We do have our own evaluation piece as well that we're going to build in. So, I can't understand why that couldn't potentially be something that could be coordinated.
I know a little bit about this. No, only because of something we're working on, because we're working with your crowd, with Curtis.
Okay.
And actually Steve and the CSAVR, not just Steve, because this research and training center on youth with mental health problems and employment, and we're actually we're in the process of putting in a what do they call a DRIP, one of the research programs specific about helping VR deal with youth with serious mental health problems, which is basically going to be the overlap, and it's involving you folks and us and the major grantees, University of Massachusetts Medical School, but also CSAVR.
Okay, and I'm sure that probably, Joe, is in my email somewhere.
Well, the communication's not always.
We're working on it, so.
Can you talk about the evaluation piece? Because I think about your work with intensive, your intensive TA work with states and the idea of you're going to be in there doing lots of different things. How are you going to evaluate that work? How are you going to identify whether you're successful or not? And identify which are practices that agencies should pursue in the future?
Okay. Of course, Todd, the researcher, asks me the research question. I should have known this is coming, right? I'm gonna do my best to do this, but I'm not gonna do it justice. So Scott Solberg out of the University of Boston is kind of the head of our evaluation component. We're gonna use the Kirkpatrick model of evaluation, so looking at short-term, medium-term, long-term outcomes. Initially, we're gonna look basically at an efficacy scale, both for probably the short and medium terms. Long term, we're planning to use the RSA 911 data. Right? Long term. I know. That's kind of the down and dirty of it. I will tell you right now, it is something that we're like, we have to do it, but we were actually really late in getting started as a center. When the project was originally written, I was not the project director in that proposal. It was someone else who subsequently left, and they got a great job, which is great for them. And then hooray for me, because here I am. So I didn't actually come on board till January, and we literally just got fully staffed for the rest of the center. And I just had the first meetings around evaluation. So I know we're not using the full Kirkpatrick model, but something like maybe a scaled version of that. So. Yeah, UMass Boston. So, but yeah, so long-term is going to be the RSA data. And you know what, I'm a big fan of that, and I think I might have been part of the suggestion for that, because in my experience, Todd, the most powerful data you can use is the system's data of the system who you're trying to change.
That's correct. If you can get agency data directly, that would be to your advantage, because it just takes such a long time for the RSA 911.
We're going to write that into the evaluation. That'll be part of the TA agreements. That they have to provide that to us.
Collaboration is such an important part, and you've talked about local level, community level, and state level collaboration. And you can measure that, do a pre-post to kind of look at the progress. We're doing that for the promise evaluations.
Yeah.
Which is kind of a neat thing, and I've done it for other evaluations, but if you can work that in, and I'd be
Okay.
happy to talk with you about that, like how to do that. So to see that level of connectivity.
Yeah, that would be really.
To do it formally, both community level and state level it would be interesting.
Yeah, I mean, very much so, because I think part of what I think our goal is, quite frankly, is to take an informal level of collaboration that's based around the individual youth and their needs. So think like person-centered planning almost, where you're bringing multiple service providers to the table based on the needs of the youth individually, right? And what you do is you coordinate those services. So you heard me talk about like coordinating a sequence of services. And in doing so, what you're able to do is you're able to have those agencies come to the table and not do anything out of the ordinary that they wouldn't already do for that youth. But instead, you're actually minimizing the burden to the agency, because now instead of the VR counselor having a $10,000 case, they have a $2,000 case, because the rest of those resources are spread amongst multiple agencies. And the beautiful thing about that, Todd, is you can actually start that without any formal MOAs or MOUs in place. But what we've seen is people being able to develop those relationships at a community level amongst service providers that can then be scaled up into that formal MOA or MOU for collaboration. So, you know, we talk about the looking at the pre-test. What does that look like? Are they actually even are they emailing other case managers at this point? Are they, so yeah, like I would definitely be interested in connecting. And I'm sure that Scott would have some questions as well. So I would be, if you're willing to have a call, we would love to talk with you.
So are you seeing the potential in that reduction in case cost related to having youth at the table from the start?
Yes. And the other thing that we see it too is the in-depth need for a different look at the career planning and management process. You know, one of the things that we've seen is that self-exploration is the first thing that needs to happen. Who am I? What are my values? This should sound very familiar to customized employment, right? But who am I? What are my values? You know, finding out who I am self-exploration wise. And then taking that and using that as the foundation for the career exploration. So, you know what? I know that I like to be busy and I need to be up and I need to be moving. And so what are the careers that involve those things? So using self-exploration to inform career exploration. Career exploration then is, those two processes that becomes part of your larger career planning and management process. So what can we help the state agencies do in developing work-based learning experiences for youth, right? How can we help the agencies in developing a cadre of employers in their communities where they can go in and do that work? How do we help VR agencies expose youth to the range of opportunities? One of the coolest things, one of the coolest models that we ever saw for career exploration was to take a cohort of students to an airport and have them see all of the different things that you can do at an airport, ranging from being a flight attendant, coming in, or a pilot, to working a customer service desk, to working in baggage, to being a mechanic, to being, a ramp person who's directing the airplane out, to being a fueler, so yeah, TSA.
And it just got worse from yesterday.
Oh yeah, I heard about that. Good thing I'm TSA pre-check.
I don't know. And now they're starting to screen as they come in to the airport too, because they don't want groups of people standing around trying in the lines. This is off subject, but
yeah. But so that example of the airport, so a really good example of exposing youth to a wide range. And, I think that's one of the other things that we really want to help, VR agencies do, is think about what are all of the things. And you know what? It's hard to keep up. And actually, I was thinking to myself, boy, chipping that career index plus thing, I might need to borrow that. But if it's available to every counselor, that's something that we can help them do. Look at the labor market information and what does that look like? And, I think it's, yeah. I'll stop talking for a minute. Other questions? Yeah. Oh, the mic.
So with the
Y-TAC, we're the Y-TAC.
For youth with different type of disabilities, we know there are different type of evidence-based practice or the focus. So would they also provide that assistance for different counselors working with people with youth with different type of disabilities?
Yeah, I mean, I think that we will definitely keep on our toes and keep abreast of what the research says and kind of what those practices are, in addition to the models that we could bring to the table that we already know. You know, so yeah, short answer, yes, we will do our best to make sure that we're incorporating and research in addition to practice. So, okay. Other questions? What time are we done?
10 more
What's that?
minutes.
10 more minutes. Other questions?
So how can, because that is always the biggest question I have is, because I'm a researcher, and we the stereotype is we stay in our Eiffel Tower to do research and publish articles that nobody would read.
Right.
So one of the
I'm glad you're aware of that
I
stereotype.
I read them, I don't always understand them.
So now what I'm trying to do is when I publish, especially something that is related to like certain, I work with like ASD and epilepsy, I try to make my student to convert it to newsletters, so to send to foundation. So what would be some of the ways that you would suggest us to be like more able to engage with these kind of technical center to provide help and like share knowledge and like be more involved?
Well, I can't speak for the other centers, but I could say that we could exchange information, and I'm always glad to. I mean, like I said, it's really important for us to have a pipeline of the research too, and you know, I will say that much like the state VR agency as a basically a program coordinator for this, like I feel like I'm you know, I can't even articulate it. How about that? It is Friday morning in all fairness, and it's been a very long week. But you know, I think as much as you can get out abstracts, like abstracts are great. You know, write a really good abstract and I'll be really happy, because that's about what you're probably going to get from me. Like I kid you not, I probably have like 10 articles printed off on my desk. They're actually on my iPad, saved in my iBooks at this point, like that I need to read. Did you notice that word need to read? I have not read yet, but so yeah, I mean, if you can write a great abstract, if if we can have some conversations with researchers and understand, you know, kind of what their research is and looking at where it crosses over with our population, so you have a good understanding and you can be like, hey, as I'm sending this out, but I thought this would be relevant, you know, particularly relevant to your center, and I mean, that would be useful to us. We're kind of in the same boat as the agencies in that sense, which is why I'm really sensitive to the agencies. So.
Yeah, and I appreciate that question, Connie, and my question was really at the spirit of that same issue. I also think that having a closer working relationship when we're planning our research so that it will meet the needs of people doing the work is important. And that's why I was hoping we could have some connections there, just so that, you know, we want to be doing work that's actually helping people, and the people who are doing the work can really help inform our planning so that we can try to bring our two strengths together.
Right. So you just opened the door to my soapbox. I hope you don't mind. I'm going to open the door and climb up on my soapbox. And my soapbox is all about, we need to be aware of what's happening on the ground. You know, I think CSA VR is wonderful, and I think all your directors are wonderful, but they're directors and they're dealing with budget and policy, and you know, they're not necessarily always seeing how policy translates in program, translates in carry out of implementation, and we know that. And so I think one of the strongest things that you can do is you can spend time on the ground. If you, as a researcher, ever get the opportunity to embed yourself in a state agency's local office, it's hard to get that. But that would be my recommendation to you as researchers, to use what you want to use the tax for. Is if we're in a state where you are, so let's say we're in Michigan, you know, like we end up in an intensive TA agreement with Michigan, that would be something that potentially we might be able to broker for you, is for you to spend an afternoon and a week, you know, observing how they're doing whatever it is. And that actually, I think, getting on the ground and understanding how the program actually works on the ground and through the lens of service delivery, that's going to generate more and greater and richer research propositions for you all than anything else. And I know you're like probably looking at me, you're like, but it's impossible for me to get that. That's where. Yeah, you should ask your TAC. I mean, you should ask the TAC if there's a TAC a technical assistance center, if there is a TAC working with that state, you know, in your state, and there are 8 of us. So at some point, it's likely that at least one of these TA centers is going to be in your state doing intensive work. You want to form a relationship with them, and you want to talk to them about seeing if they can connect you with the agency, because they're going to be working closely with the agency. So, and you know, most of them, I tend to think that state VR folks are very reasonable, and if you talk to them, you know, and you say, hey, look, this is what I'm trying to do, and I'm trying to develop something that is richer and more meaningful to you, they're going to be all on board. I mean, that's
As long as it meets their priorities too.
right.
I talk to a lot. I think state agency people are reasonable, and I used to be one, so I understand. But it's hard, you know, if I'm trying to sell them something that they don't want.
Right.
So that's why I was wondering, you know what they want.
Right. We've got a good idea anyway, because they at least want us, because that's why we're there. Because quite frankly, we're in the same boat. I mean, as a technical assistance center, they're not required to take our TA, you know, so the best thing that I can do is help them understand, you know, what it is that we can provide that's going to help them meet their goals. It's the same principle. So I get it. It's a conundrum at times. So, all right. Everybody good? That was a lot more talking than I had anticipated.
No, I'm good.
Thank you.
Thank you. Great job.